So having read about some of the great disciples of the Buddha, Sariputta, Moggallana, in the life of the Buddha, there's a bhikkhu who, it's not quite clear exactly when he appeared, but it wasn't too far on. So teachings from this particular bhikkhu start showing up in the life of the Buddha, but it never really says when he showed up. And so I thought I would read the chapter from Great Disciples of the Buddha on Mahākassapa, as he's another very, really central figure in the life of the Buddha. And I'm just going to read this entire chapter. It's Mahākassapa, Father of the Sangha, written by Hellmuth, chapter 3 of Great Disciples of the Buddha. And I'm going to read just straight through the whole chapter because some of the previous lives of Mahākassapa are quite interesting as well. Kassapa's early years. Shortly before his parinibbana, the Buddha had refused to appoint a personal successor. Instead, he urged the monks to look upon the Dhamma and the Vinaya, the doctrine and the discipline, as their master, for within the teachings proclaimed during his 45-year ministry, they could find all the instructions they needed to tread the path to deliverance. Nevertheless, though the monks did not select a successor, in the period immediately following the Blessed One's demise, the community came to regard with increasing reverence one solitary elder whose person emanated a natural aura of strength and authority. This figure, whom the Pali commentaries describe as the disciple who was the Buddha's counterpart, the Buddha Patibhaga Savaka, was known as the Venerable Mahākassapa. There were many factors that contributed to Mahākassapa's rise to preeminence in the newly orphaned Sangha. He shared with the Buddha 7 of the 32 marks of a great man and had been praised by the Master for his meditative attainments and realizations. He was the only monk with whom the Buddha had exchanged robes, a special honor. Mahākassapa possessed to the highest degree the 10 qualities that inspire confidence. He was also a model of a disciplined and austere life devoted to meditation. So it is hardly surprising that he assumed the presidency of the first council of the Sangha, which had been summoned on his urgent advice. Evidently, it was for the same reasons that, much later in China and Japan, this redoubtable elder came to be regarded as the first patriarch of Chan or Zen Buddhism. Like the 2 chief disciples, Sariputta and Moggallana, Mahākassapa was of Brahmin descent. Some years before the Bodhisattva's own birth, he was born in the Magadha country in the village of Mahatita as the son of the Brahmin Kapila and his wife Sumana Devi. He was named Pipali. His father owned 16 villages over which he ruled like a small king, so Pipali grew up in the midst of wealth and luxury. Yet already in his youth he felt a longing to leave the worldly life behind, and hence he did not want to marry. When his parents repeatedly urged him to take a wife, he told them that he would look after them as long as they lived, but that after their deaths he would become an ascetic. Yet they insisted again and again that he should take a wife, and thus, just to comfort his mother, he finally agreed to marry, on the condition that a girl could be found who conformed to his idea of perfection. For that purpose, he commissioned goldsmiths to fashion for him a golden statue of a beautiful maiden. He had it bedecked with fine garments and ornaments and showed it to his parents, saying, "If you can find a maiden like this for me, I shall remain in the home life." But his mother was a clever woman and thought, "Surely my son must have done deeds of merit in the past, and he must have done them together with a woman who is the counterpart of this golden image." Thus she approached 8 Brahmins, showered them with rich gifts, and asked them to take the image and travel around in search of a human likeness of it. The Brahmins thought, "Let us first go to the Bhadda country, which is a gold mine of beautiful women." There they found Sagala, a girl whose beauty equaled that of the image. She was Bhadda-kapilānī, a wealthy Brahmin's daughter, age 16, 4 years younger than Pipali Kassapa. Her parents agreed to the marriage proposal, and the Brahmins returned to tell of their success. Yet Bhadda-kapilānī too did not wish to marry. Like Pipali, she longed to live a religious life and wished to leave home life as a female ascetic. Such correspondence between her aspiration and that of Pipali was not due to chance, but sprang from the strong kamic bond they had forged in previous lives. Maturing in the present life, this bond was to unite them in marriage in their youth and to lead to a decisive separation later on, a separation which was again to be resolved by a union at a higher level, when both consummated their spiritual endeavors by winning the supreme fruit of arhatship under the Buddha. Pipali was most distressed to hear that his plot had been foiled and that his parents had actually found a girl who matched the golden statue. Still intent on escaping from his agreement, he sent the following letter to the girl: "Bhadda, please marry someone else of equal status and live a happy home life with him. As for myself, I shall become an ascetic. Please do not have regrets." Bhadda-kapilānī, like-minded as she was, independently sent him a similar letter. But their parents, suspecting such an exchange would take place, had both letters intercepted on the way and replaced them by letters of welcome. So Bhadda was taken to Magadha, and the young couple were married. However, in accordance with their ascetic yearning, both agreed to maintain a life of celibacy. To give expression to their decision, each night they would lay a garland of flowers between them before they went to bed, resolving, "If on either side the flowers wilt, we shall understand that the person on whose side they wilted has given rise to a lustful thought." At night they lay awake all night long from fear of making bodily contact. During the day they did not even smile at one another. As long as their parents lived, they remained aloof from worldly enjoyment, and they did not even have to look after the estate's farms. When Pipali's parents died, the couple took charge of the large property. It was then that they felt the spur that sent them on the course of renunciation. One day, as Pipali was inspecting the fields, he saw as if with new eyes, something that he had seen so often before. He observed when his farmhands plowed the land, many birds gathered and eagerly picked the worms from the furrows. This sight, so common to a farmer, now startled him. It struck him forcefully that what brought him his wealth, the produce of his fields, was bound up with the suffering of other living beings. His livelihood was purchased with the death of so many worms and other little creatures living in the soil. Thinking about this, he asked one of his laborers, "Who will have to bear the consequences of such an evil action?" "You yourself, sir," was the answer. And this is a slightly different view than the view of karma taught by the Buddha, but it is something that, according to the story, spurred him to want to leave the home life. Shaken by that insight into karmic retribution, Pipali went home and reflected, "If I have to carry along the burden of guilt for this killing, of what use to me is all my wealth? I would be better off giving it all to Bhadda and going forth into the ascetic life." But at home, at about the same time, Bhadda had a similar experience, seeing afresh with a deeper understanding something she had very often seen before. Her servants had spread out sesame seeds to dry in the sun, and crows and other birds ate the insects that had been attracted by the seeds. When Bhadda asked her servants, who had to account morally for the violent death of so many creatures, she was told that the karmic responsibility was hers. Then she thought, "If even by this much I'm committing karma, I won't be able to lift my head above the ocean of rebirths even in 1,000 lives. As soon as Pipali returns, I shall hand over everything to him and leave and take up the ascetic life." When both found themselves in accord, they had saffron cloth and clay bowls brought for them from the bazaar, and then shaved each other's head. They thus became like ascetic wanderers, and they made the aspiration, "We dedicate our going forth to the arhants in the world." Even though they had not yet encountered the Buddha or his teaching, they knew instinctively that they should follow the ascetic life in a state of adopted discipleship to the truly wise and holy ones, whoever they might be. Then, slinging their alms bowls over their shoulders, they left the manor house unnoticed by the servants. When, however, they reached the next village, which belonged to the estate, the laborers and their families saw them. Crying and lamenting, they fell at the feet of the two ascetics and exclaimed, "Oh, dear and noble ones, why do you want to make us helpless orphans?" "It is because we have seen the three worlds to be like a house of fire that we go forth into the homeless life." To those who were serfs, Pipali Kassapa granted freedom, and he and Bhadda continued on, leaving the villagers behind, still weeping. As they walked, Kassapa went ahead, while Bhadda followed behind him. Then the thought occurred to Kassapa, "Now, this Bhaddā-kapilānī follows me close behind, and she is a woman of great beauty. Some people could easily think, though they are ascetics, they still cannot live without each other. What they are doing is unseemly. If they spoil their minds by such false thoughts or even spread evil rumors, they will cause great harm to themselves. It is better that we separate." Thus, when they reached a crossroads, Kassapa told her what he had been thinking and said to her, "Bhadda, you take one of these roads and I shall go the other way." She replied, "It is true, for ascetics, a woman is an obstacle. People might suspect us of misconduct and slander us, so let us part. You go your way and I'll go my way." She then respectfully circumambulated him 3 times, saluted his feet, and with folded hands she spoke. "Our close relationship and friendship that had lasted for an unfathomable past comes to an end today. Please take the path to the right, and I shall take the other road." Thus they parted and went their individual ways, seeking the high goal of arhantship, final deliverance from suffering. It is said that the earth, shaken by the power of their virtue, quaked and trembled, and peals of thunder came forth from the sky, and the mountains at the edge of the world system resounded. Bhaddā-kapilānī. Let us first follow Bhaddā-kapilānī. Her road led to Savatthi, where she listened to the Buddha's discourses at the Jetavana Monastery. As the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the order of nuns, did not yet exist at that time. So this is interesting. Yeah, this does give, actually, I didn't notice this before, it does give a time period that it's quite early on. As the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the order of nuns, did not yet exist at that time, she took up residence at a nunnery of non-Buddhist female ascetics not far from Jetavana. There she lived for 5 years until she could obtain ordination as a bhikkhuni. It was not long afterward that she attained the goal of the holy life, arhantship. The Buddha praised Bhadda as being the foremost among the nuns who could recollect their past lives. The Pali commentary and the Pali commentaries and the Jataka stories leave us with a record of some of her former existences in which she had been Kassapa's wife. One day she uttered the following verses in which she praised Mahākassapa and declared her own attainment. A son of the Buddha and his rightful heir, Kassapa, who is well concentrated, knows his abodes in previous lives and sees the heavens and plains of woe. He too has attained the destruction of birth, a sage consummate in direct knowledge. Endowed with these 3 modes of knowledge, the Brahman is a triple knowledge bearer. Just so is Bhaddā-kapilānī, a triple knowledge nun who has left death behind. Having conquered Mara and his mount, she lives bearing her final body. Having seen the grave danger in the world, we both went forth into homelessness. Now we are destroyers of the cankers, tamed and cool. We have won Nibbana. That's from the Thera 63 to 66. As an Arahant Bhikkhuni, Bhadda devoted herself chiefly to the education of the younger nuns and their instruction in monastic discipline. In the Bhikkhuni Vibhanga, instances are recorded involving her pupils which led to the prescribing of certain disciplinary rules for bhikkhunis. There were also 2 instances when Bhaddā-kapilānī had to bear the envy of another nun who was hostile toward Mahākassapa as well. The nun Tulananda was learned in the Dhamma and a good preacher, but evidently she had more intelligence than gentleness of heart. She was self-willed and not prepared to change her conduct, as evidenced by several Vinaya texts. When Bhadda, too, became a popular preacher of Dhamma, even preferred by some of Tulananda's own pupils, Tulananda became jealous. In order to annoy Bhadda, once she and her pupil nuns walked up and down in front of Bhadda's cell, reciting loudly. She was censured by the Buddha on that account. Another time, at Bhadda's request, she had arranged temporary living quarters for Bhadda when the latter visited Savatthi. But then, in another fit of jealousy, she threw her out of those quarters. Bhadda, however, being an arhat, was no longer affected by such happenings and looked at them with detachment and compassion. So, Tulananda, she comes up in various places as being buddies with the group of 6, the misbehavior monks. The samsaric background. Mahākassapa and Bhaddā-kapilānī originally formed their aspirations to great discipleship under the Buddha Padumuttara, the 15th Buddha of antiquity, who arose 100,000 aeons in the past and had his main monastic seat in the Kema Deer Park near the city of Hangsawati. At that time, the future Kassapa was a wealthy landowner named Wedeha, and Bhadda was his wife. One day, Wedeha went to the monastery and was seated in the assembly at the very moment that the teacher declared an elder named Mahānisaba, his 3rd preeminent disciple, the foremost of the proponents of the ascetic practices, etagang dutawadanang. The lay devotee Wedeha was pleased by this and invited the teacher and his entire sangha to his home for the next day's meal. While the Buddha and the monks were in his house taking their meal, the lay devotee caught sight of the elder Mahānisaba walking on his alms round down the street. He went outside and invited the elder to join the gathering, but the elder declined. Wedeha then took his bowl, filled it with food, and brought it back to him. When he returned to the house, he asked the Buddha about the reason for the elder's strange refusal. The teacher explained, "Lay devotee, we accept invitations to homes for meals, but that bhikkhu lives solely on food gained on alms round. We live in town monasteries, but he lives solely in the forest. We live with a roof over our head, but he lives out in the open air." When the lay devotee heard this, he became even more pleased, like an, quote, like an oil lamp sprinkled with oil, unquote. And he reflected, "Why should I be satisfied simply with arhatship? I will make an aspiration to become the foremost disciple among the practitioners of the ascetic practices under a Buddha in the future." Then he invited the Buddha and the community of monks to his home for alms for a week, made presentations of the triple robe to the entire sangha, and prostrating himself at the master's feet, he declared his aspiration. The Buddha Padumuttara looked into the future and saw the aspiration would be fulfilled. He then gave Wedeha the prediction. In the future, 100,000 aeons from now, a Buddha named Gautama will arise in the world. Under him you will be the 3rd chief disciple named Mahākassapa. Bhadda, on her part, had been inspired by the bhikkhuni pronounced the foremost among those who recollect their past lives, and she formed the aspiration to attain this position under a future Buddha. She too was assured by the Lord Padumuttara that her wish would be fulfilled. For the rest of their lives, the couple observed the precepts and did meritorious deeds, and after death, they were reborn in heaven. The next past life recorded for Mahākassapa and Bhaddā-kapilānī takes place much later, during the dispensation of the Buddha Vipassi, the sixth predecessor of the Buddha Gautama. At this time, they had been a poor Brahmin couple. They were so extremely poor that they had only a single upper garment, and hence only one of them at a time could go out of their hut. In this story, the Brahmin was therefore called he with one garment, ekasataka. Though it may not be easy for us to understand such extreme poverty, it will still be more difficult to understand that there have been many people for whom such utter poverty did not mean subjective deprivation. This was so with these two beings who later were to be Kassapa and Bhadda. In their life as that poor Brahmin couple, they had lived in such perfect harmony that their happiness was not diminished by their indigence. One day, when the Buddha Vipassi was to give a special sermon, they both wished to attend, but as they had only a single upper garment between them, they could not both go at the same time. The wife went during the day, and her husband went at night. As the Brahmin listened to the sermon, the value of giving and generosity became so deeply impressed on his mind that he wanted to offer his only upper garment to the Buddha. But after he had so resolved, scruples came to his mind. This is our only upper garment, so perhaps I should first consult with my wife. How can we manage without an upper garment? How can we get a replacement? But he resolutely pushed aside all such hesitation and placed the garment at the Blessed One's feet. Having done so, he clapped his hands and joyfully called out, "I have vanquished! I have vanquished!" When the king, who had listened to the sermon behind a curtain, heard that shout of victory and came to know the reason, he sent sets of garments to the Brahmin and later made him his court chaplain, so the couple's plight had come to an end. As a result of his selfless giving, the Brahmin was reborn in a celestial world. After parting from there, he became a king on earth, a great benefactor of his people who generously supported the ascetics living at that time. Bhadda was then his chief queen. As to Bhadda, she was once the mother of a Brahmin youth who was a pupil of the Bodhisattva and wanted to become an ascetic. Kassapa was her husband, Ananda her son. Bhadda had wanted her son to know the worldly life before she would permit him to become an ascetic, but that knowledge came to the young Brahmin in a drastic and heart-rending way. His teacher's old mother fell passionately in love with him and was even ready to kill her son for his sake. This encounter with reckless passion caused in him a deep revulsion for worldly life, and after that experience, his parents gave him permission to go forth as an ascetic. That's from Jataka 61. Another time, Kassapa and Bhadda had been the Brahmin parents of 4 sons, who in the future were to be our Bodhisattva, Anuruddha, Sariputta, and Mahamoggallana. All 4 wanted to become ascetics. At first, the parents refused permission, but later they came to understand the fruits and benefits of the ascetic life, and they themselves became ascetics. It's from Jataka 509. In still another life, 2 village headmen who were friends decided that the children they were expecting should marry each other, even if they were of the opposite sex. The children they were expecting should marry each other if they were of the opposite sex, and so it happened. But in this previous life of both children had been deities in the Brahma world, hence they had no desire for sensual pleasures, and with their parents' permission chose the ascetic life. That's Jataka 540. Bhadda's only wrong act, reported in the stories of her past lives, was this. At a time between the appearance of 2 Buddhas, Bhadda was the wife of a landowner. One day she had a quarrel with her sister-in-law. Just then, a Pacceka Buddha drew near to their house on alms round. When her sister-in-law offered him food, Bhadda, seeking to spite her, took the Pacceka Buddha's bowl, threw away the food, and filled the bowl with mud. At once, however, she was stung by remorse. She took the bowl back, washed it with scent, and filled it with delicious, fragrant food. Then she offered it back to the Pacceka Buddha and apologized for her rudeness. As a comic consequence of this deed, a mixture of the dark and bright, in her next life, Bhadda possessed wealth and great beauty, but her body exuded a loathsome odor. Her husband, the future Kassapa, could not bear the noxious smell and left her. As she was beautiful, other suitors sought her hand, but all her later marriages had the same end. She was full of despair and felt there was no point in continuing to live. To dispose of her property, she had her ornaments melted down and formed into a golden brick, which she brought to the monastery as a contribution to the stupa being erected in honor of the Buddha Kassapa, who had just passed away. She offered the golden brick with great devotion, and as a consequence, her body became fragrant again, and her first husband, Kassapa, took her back. 2 lives before her present existence, Bhadda was the queen of Benares and used to support several Pacceka Buddhas. Deeply moved by their sudden death, she renounced her worldly life as a queen and lived a meditative life in the Himalayas. By the power of her renunciation and her meditative attainments, she was reborn in a Brahma world, and so was Kassapa. It was after that life in the Brahma world that they were reborn in the human world as Pipali Kassapa and Bhaddā-kapilānī. From these accounts, we gather that in their former existences both had lived a life of purity in the Brahma world, and that both had repeatedly been renunciates. Hence, in their final existence, it was not difficult for them to keep to a life of celibacy, to give up all possessions, and to follow the Buddha's teaching to its culmination in arhatship. How Kassapa came to the Buddha. Continuing our story, we shall now turn to Mahākassapa. Where did he go after he had come to the crossroads? As mentioned above, when the 2 ascetics separated, the earth shook by the force of their act of renunciation. The Buddha perceived this trembling of the earth and knew that it meant an outstanding disciple was on the way to him. Without informing any of the monks, he set out on the road alone, walking the distance of 5 miles to meet his future pupil, an act of compassion which later was often praised. On the road between Rajagaha and Nalanda, the master sat down under a banyan tree by the Bahuputaka shrine, waiting for his future disciple to arrive. So, by inference, we could say possibly the Buddha, that this was during the period when the Buddha was living at the bamboo grove, the squirrel sanctuary, and that Sariputta and Mahamoggallana had perhaps just come around that time as well. The Buddha, waiting for his future disciple to arrive, he did not sit there like an ordinary ascetic, but displayed all the sublime glory of a Buddha. He emitted rays of light for 80 meters all around, so that the entire thicket became a single mass of light, and he manifested all his 32 marks of a great man. When Kassapa reached the spot and saw the Buddha sitting there in the full splendor of an enlightened one, he thought, "This must be my master, for whose sake I have gone forth." He approached the Buddha, fell at his feet, and exclaimed, "The Blessed One, Lord, is my teacher, and I am his disciple. The Blessed One is my teacher, and I am his disciple." The enlightened one said, "Kassapa, if anyone who does not know and see were to say to a disciple endowed with such sincerity as yourself, 'I know, I see,' his head would split. But Kassapa, knowing, I say, I know, seeing, I say, I see." He then gave Kassapa the following 3 exhortations as his first formal introduction to the Dhamma. "You should train yourself thus, Kassapa. A keen sense of shame and fear of wrongdoing, hiriotapa, shall be present in me towards seniors, novices, and those of middle status in the order. Whatever teaching I hear that is conducive to something wholesome, I shall listen with an attentive ear, examining it, reflecting on it, absorbing it with all my heart. Mindfulness of the body linked with gladness shall not be neglected by me. Thus should you train yourself." According to the commentary, this triple exhortation constituted Kassapa's going forth in higher ordination together. And this is interesting because this is the Te Owada Upasampada, and this is one. There's these different ways of being ordained. So The first way of being ordained, the Ehi Bhikkhu ordination, is in the very earliest days of the Buddha, sometimes the Buddha would say Ehi Bhikkhu, such as the first 5 disciples, or Angulimala, he would say Ehi Bhikkhu, that constituted their ordinations, the Kam Bhikkhu ordination. And then once the Sangha started growing, the Buddha gave permission for the 3 refuges ordination, so that's the second type of ordination. And then the Kassapa ordination is the only instance of this third type of ordination, which is the 3 Ovadas, the Theravada Upasampada. And then the fourth type of ordination, which is what we have today, is the motion and 3 announcements ordination, where you have the whole questioning in the Sangha, outside of the Sangha, inside of the Sangha. So there's those 4 different types of ordination recorded in the canon. Some accounts will say there's 5 in terms of the first 5 disciples. The Buddha never really said Ehi Bhikkhu to them, but they were just automatically bhikkhus. When the Buddha said bhikkhus, when the Buddha called them bhikkhus, they were automatically bhikkhus at that point. So that's some accounts will call that the first 5 savakas, upasampada. And I'll just read a bit more here for today. Then both master and disciple walked toward Rajagaha. On the way, the Buddha wanted to rest and went off the road to the root of a tree. Mahākassapa then folded his double robe in 4 and requested the master to sit on it, as this will be for my benefit for a long time. The Buddha sat down on Kassapa's robe and said, "Soft is your robe of patched cloth, Kassapa." Hearing this, Kassapa replied, "May the Blessed One, Lord, accept this robe of patched cloth out of compassion for me." "But, Kassapa, can you wear these hempen, worn-out rag robes of mine?" Full of joy, Kassapa said, "Certainly, Lord, I can wear the Blessed One's rough and worn-out rag robes." This exchange of robes bestowed a great distinction on the Venerable Mahākassapa, an honor not shared by any other disciple. The commentary explains that the Buddha's intention in exchanging robes with Kassapa was to motivate him to observe the dhutangas, the austere practices, from the time of his very admission into the Bhikkhu Sangha. Although, after his enlightenment, the Buddha condemned extreme self-mortification as a blind alley which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial, he by no means rejected those ascetic practices that harmonized with the framework of the middle way. The true middle way is not a comfortable highway built out of easy compromises, but a lonely, steep ascent, which requires the renunciation of craving and the ability to endure hardship and discomfort. Hence, the Buddha encouraged those monks who were truly keen on extricating from their hearts the subtlest roots of craving to adopt the dhutangas, special vows of austerity conducive to simplicity, contentment, renunciation, and energy, and he often applauded those monks who observed these vows. The ancient suttas repeatedly commend several austere practices, using only the triple set of robes, wearing only rag robes, subsisting only on food collected on alms round, living only in the forest. In the commentaries, the list of austere practices is expanded to 13, which are explained in detail in such works on the meditative life as the Visuddhimagga. The robe that the Buddha offered Kassapa was made from a shroud that he had picked up in a cremation ground, and in asking Kassapa whether he could wear the robe, he was implicitly asking whether he would be able to make the full commitment to the austere practices that the use of such a robe would entail. When Kassapa affirmed that he could wear the robe, he was saying, "Yes, Lord, I can fulfill the ascetic practices you wish me to undertake." From that moment on, Kassapa pledged himself to uphold a life of strict austerity, and even in old age, he insisted on observing the same vows that he had undertaken in his youth. On a later occasion, the Buddha declared Mahākassapa foremost among the bhikkhus who observed the austere practices, thereby bringing to fulfillment Kassapa's original aspiration, formed 100,000 aeons in the past. It was only 7 days after his ordination and the exchange of robes that Kassapa attained the goal he was striving for, arhatship, the mind's final liberation from defilements. Recounting this episode to Ananda at a much later time, he declared, "For 7 days, friend, I ate the alms food of the country as a debtor. Then on the 8th day, the final knowledge of arhatship arose in me." That's from Samyutta Nikaya 16:11. So there's more in this chapter in terms of Mahākassapa's contributions to the Sangha and a lot of his teachings, which are very good, very enjoyable to hear about. So we'll continue on tomorrow with this chapter on Mahākassapa. We'll leave it there for today. Questions, comments? If anybody does want to know more about the dhutangas.
There's a Jataka tale where the Buddha does the same thing as Mahākassapa. He wants to be an ascetic, his parents won't let him. So he fashions this golden image of a woman, and his parents find that individual somewhere and he's forced to marry. I'm curious, this practice of ascetic, one of the ascetics through time, or is this maybe do you think the two stories got conflated?
There's probably a lot of stories that have been conflated in the suttas and the commentaries and the jatakas, and if it gets even more conflated when you get into like Theravada, comparing Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. There's all sorts of things that could have come from different places. Like for example, when there's a sutta where the Buddha is talking to, there is like the Q&A session with this young, arrogant Brahmin and he doesn't want to answer the Buddha's questions, and the Buddha says, if you don't answer a question after a third time, give it to you from the Tathagata, this is not good. And then there's this yaka floating over him with a giant hammer getting ready to split his head, and the yaka's name is Vajrapani, which is kind of curious that there's a Vajrapani Sutra in the Mahayana. So you do see these names and stuff curiously come up from time to time. So it could be a conflation of stories or legends as well. Yeah, if anybody wants to know more about the dhutangas or is curious about studying about them, in the Visuddhimagga, there's the kind of, it lines out the list of 13, the like light, medium, and hard ways of practicing them. So that's really, in the Theravada and Buddhist countries, the way the dhutangas are lined up in the Visuddhimagga is kind of how they're understood and how we practiced. And some of them you can't always follow them. Like the living at the foot of a tree is only allowable outside of the Vasa period. So in the Vasa, rule bound to have a dwelling place. So some of them are just time bound, just shorter, longer periods of time. Some of them might be able to take on for longer, like sitters practice or the alms round practice. there's one that cancels, there's two of them will cancel each other out, so like living under the root of the tree cancels out living in the open air. Living in the open air implies you're not living at the root of a tree. So you can't, our mind might think, I want to keep all 13 of them, but you can't actually keep all 13 at the same time. Is that story of the monk, or the Western monk who wanted to, before the Vasa of the Buddha?
Very keen.
But it is good to experiment, taking on one or more of these at different periods of time to test oneself and learn how to practice in different ways.